Today's episode of Socially Democratic is dedicated to my mum, Cecilia Donnelly, who passed away last week. I joke about how many people listen to this show, but in all fairness, Mum is definitely one of our listeners. She listened to every single episode from day one, although I don't think she knew what the name of the podcast was. I think she just told her sisters and her friends, it's the podcast on the iPad. My own political journey into Labor politics doesn't happen without my parents, and in particular my mum shaping my values. Mum, like so many of our parents, weren't members of the Labor Party, but they voted Labor at every single election, and they expressed their values through their actions, not their words. Mum kept me and my siblings grounded and always reminded us to never forget where we came from. So much so I even named my campaign consultancy Dunn Street after the street that Mum and Dad moved into, a commission home at 23 Dunn Street, Warrigal, after they immigrated out from Scotland in the late 1950s. And I just wanted to take this opportunity of thanking people in the Labor movement who have sent messages of condolence and solidarity to me over the last couple of days. I really do appreciate that. And it's somewhat appropriate that today's episode is with a fellow Scotsman, John McTernan. And I know that Mum would have enjoyed this conversation about the politics of the country where she grew up. So here's today's episode. Rest in peace, Mum. We are taping this one on a Wednesday evening on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And joining us on the line from London, he's a former communications director for the British Prime Minister Tony Blair and the Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard. He's a regular guest on the pod for all things UK politics. It's great to have him back on the show to talk about the UK elections that are coming up. John McTernan, welcome back to Socially Democratic.
It's great to be back.
Lot to get through. Before we dive in, I just want to give our listeners a bit of an overview of, I guess, what we'd call the state of the race heading into this election. There's 650 seats in the House of Commons. You need 326 of them to form government. The Conservatives currently have 344, Labor on 205. And if my maths is right, then Labor needs about 121 seats to form government. Is that right? 121, roughly? Yeah. Anyway. So lots to talk.
Labour need, on paper, they need a swing as big as Tony Blair got in 1997, and he only needs to win 30 or 40 seats. Labour need to win 125, 130 seats to just have a bare majority, and so this is one of the biggest mountains that the Labour Party in the UK has ever had to climb.
Great, and I think that's a good contextual setting for about how we are going to climb this mountain. But to begin with, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called a surprise snap election set down for the Thursday, the 4th of July, when many predicted that he would go full term. First of all, John, were you surprised by this? And second of all, why did he do this?
So I was surprised by it, not as surprised as the Tory party were. The Cabinet were surprised. The Conservative Party hadn't selected all its candidates for the election. Labour had got all its candidates in place. And that suggests that it was something quite an emotional thing. It was like a sudden, I've had it. I don't want to carry on doing it. And the first few days showed strategic missteps or Titanic proportions. And I mean Titanic, because you can't announce an election from Number 10. It's an official building. You do it on the street outside to cameras. It was rain. It was torrential rain. Rishi Sunak stood in torrential rain and announced it. He didn't have a guy holding an umbrella behind him. He didn't go to a Conservative office and do it. So he was saying, we have a plan. Like a man who doesn't take a brolly out into a downpour has got no chance of having a plan. Then he did literally go to Belfast to the Titanic Quarter to do an election event. It's like Titanic. And he was talking to journalists on a plane, and behind visible was the exit sign. He went to a brewery in Wales. He's notably a teetotaler, so he actually literally couldn't organise a piss up in that brewery. And he asked Welsh football fans how they're looking forward to the Euros, and Wales famously didn't qualify for the Euros this year. So it had a kind of cack-handedness to it, and his offer for young people is the return of conscription, which is, there's just no way you can tie together anything in this apart from maybe he's just decided, I've had it. And I had read that he was saying to Tory backbenchers, if you try to take me out as leader, if you try to roll me, I'll call an election. And the date being floated for that election was the 4th of July. So that was his threat. And it may well be he saw there were enough people and he just thought, I'll call your bluff. And basically, he's going to blow up the Conservative Party. And they have struggled to get traction. And they've been challenged on the right by Nigel Farage. So I can't see any political logic to it, but it's raised a question which has not yet, for me, been answered. And it's a good question. Why did a man who's so bad at politics want to be Prime Minister? When he worked for Goldman Sachs, he was perfectly profitable. He's married to his wife is a billionaire. There's no reason for him to be an MP, let alone the Prime Minister.
In all of your years as a campaign communication strategist, advisor, director, was that the worst start to a electoral campaign that you have ever seen?
It was the absolute worst I've ever seen. It's worse even than the Labour Party in 1983. And I remember the Labour Party in 1983. And I know there's an amazing story from that, which is the Labour Party's National Executive Committee, like the Australian Labour Party's National Executive Committee. It's made up of trade unionists as well as activists who are elected by the party and MPs and cabinet members. And during one of the meetings, one union leader turned to the guy beside him and said, I don't recognise who you are. Which union are you? And the guy said, no, I'm police. I'm the special branch protection for the leader of the Labour Party. And that was the chaos. I always thought that was the most chaotic story I'd ever heard about an election campaign. Sunak is providing them in so many numbers. On the 80th anniversary of D-Day, the last D-Day celebrations to which any veterans will be able to go who were actually present at the D-Day landings, he left early. He left early to come home and sign off the Conservative Party manifesto. And so he was not there in the pictures with President Biden, President Macron, people who were talking about the sacrifices that were made. And such an instance, I've heard Conservative Party voters, both friends of mine, but also people in Vox Pops, the pain in their voice when they talk about the disdain to the sacrifice. They couldn't believe it. And then that is after the Tories said that their leading youth policy was conscription, a return to national service. I think this election will be taught in classes of politics for years, decades.
Let's talk about the issues first and just sort of frame it up for us, for the listenership that's outside of the UK. What are the issues that will be in the front of minds of voters as they go into the polls in a few weeks' time that's going to be shaping how they vote? So
it's important to think about the issues and then think about the Labour Party's response to it, because it's a very sophisticated response to it. The big issue is cost of living. That's everywhere in the global north, cost of living in all the big elections. That's one of the big drivers. The UK, the health service is in its worst position than it's been for an incredibly long time. There's 7.5 million people on waiting lists for treatment in the National Health Service. It's inconceivable, really, that should be the situation. And crime is an issue. The Tories have tried to make immigration, irregular migration, boats, an issue, and they have been persuaded by their Australian strategist Isaac Levido that you can adopt an Australian approach. You can say stop the boats. They clearly didn't ask Isaac Levido, is Australia very close to another country like Britain is to France? And Levido didn't say, like, there's an ocean between Australia and other countries. The boats come across an ocean. Boats come across the English Channel. So they're kind of, it seems, there are issues the public have, but the biggest issue is they think that the country is broken. Nothing works, whether it's the trains, whether it's the hospitals, whether it's the police force. And there's a sense in my mind that the Tory party's most effective strategy has been to lower people's belief that anything can ever be made better. So they can't run a government. They want to try to prove to people that no government can make a change. So Labour's have to try and really get up the slogan, it's time for a change. And the Labour Party have made their slogan change. But the big difference they're trying to make in politics is all of our discourse in the UK is tax and spend. So if Labour says they want to do something on health or policing or migration, people say, how are you going to pay for it? And Labour has said only Thatcherites say you should cut tax and cut public spending, and only Corbynites say you should raise taxes and raise public spending. There's a third way, and that third way is to turbocharge the growth in the economy. And that is a very radical manifesto the Labour Party have, but it's one that the journalists, the media find really hard to deal with because they get used to saying, how will you pay for it? How will you pay for it? And the answer is, we're actually going to grow the economy. We know where the blockages are and we can remove them. So there's a thing being geared up to by the Labour Party that they'll have to go into overdrive when they come into government to communicate this, because at the moment you have to use the media to communicate. When you're government, you have all the abilities to speak, to communicate, to use social media. And so I think there's a big post-election challenge for Labour. They've got the issues right. They've got the trust of the people. There's been a 20-point lead for nearly 2 years. And that only gets wider. So it feels a very dull election, a very boring election, and the country's kind of turned off it because they really have no interest in it. They just want it over quickly.
This third way that you're talking about in terms of how Labor is trying to reject these previous kind of paradigms about how you manage the economy, how is that manifesting in the policies that they're taking to the election?
So the two main pillars of it are infrastructure and decarbonisation. Those are obviously jargon terms you don't campaign around. Vote Labour for decarbonisation, but it's really understood that we have to, because of climate crisis, decarbonise the economy, and so Britain's going to have a Great British Energy, which is a publicly owned energy company with £9 billion of capital in it, to partner with renewable companies to de-risk their investments and therefore lower the cost of their developing innovations and then manufacturing, and for the government to take a stake. So therefore the government is investing, de-risking, lowering costs, and then going to make a profit in the end as a partner. And that is a very different industrial strategy. Paralleling that is a national wealth fund paid for by a windfall tax on oil and gas majors and their windfall profits. That national wealth fund is going to go into manufacturing. It's going to go into green steel. It's going to go into green hydrogen. And in these ways, you're kind of very vividly saying the green economy has got jobs, it's got working class jobs, it's got well-paid working class jobs. It's a version of Bidenomics, and it's in terms of its ambition and its scale of investment, it's broadly similar per capita per head as what Biden's done in the Inflation Reduction Act. And on the other side, there's a deregulatory approach to planning, which is normally the development cycle in the UK for housing or factory building or any kind of big development is 10 years. Labour is going to deregulate planning to take away the blockages. And if you change the planning cycle to 8 years, not 10 years, that's a massive improvement in productivity. And I think those two things are understandable. People want more homes. If you build homes, people get themselves the home that they want to buy or the home they want to rent, and you get employment in that way. So the growth pillars are in that sense those. And then there is just the ambition of having a government that says we can have an industrial strategy. And I sometimes say to other people in the media and say on TV and radio, what Labour are doing is they're showing there's a social democratic plan for growth, and that we shouldn't apologise for it. There's going to be 2/3 of the country going to vote for a progressive party, for the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, the Labour Party. 40-odd% are going to vote Labour. And I said we should stand and say we're doing this as Social Democrats. We'll lead a progressive movement in the country, but we're not worried about the Greens because we're not Greens. Greens aren't on a Social Democrat spectrum. They're not left-right. They're a different beat. So I think we need to have more confidence and more punch and more behind what we're saying. But it is a radical break with the past, and I think it's a break with neoliberal governance, and that's a huge paradigm shift actually if it's stuck to, and I think it will be.
The last time I think you and I spoke on the podcast, we were talking about Keir Starmer's leadership, and at the time, Labor was doing well in the polls and have continued to do so. I just want to get a sort of a heat check from you or a vibe check on his leadership and how he's been perceived by punters on the street in this campaign.
So that's a really good question. And his approval ratings are rising. Now, his approval ratings are not as good as, say, Tony Blair's were in 96, 97. And that is because all politicians are less popular than they used to be. The last 15 years, 14 years of Tory rule, the 5 prime ministers in 6 years, which is, it's Australian in its rapidity of turnover of prime ministers. It's actually worse than Australia. And it's led to a cynicism in the public. And that's applied to anybody. The bigger barrier to reaching to the punters is we're saying change and they don't believe anything can change. But Keir has found a voice. He's got a great speechwriter, and I think you and your listeners know one of the important things that politicians have is language. They use language, and those with great speechwriters have a greater impact on the public. And Keir's found his voice, found his speechwriter. He's also found his look, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled up. It suits him, it works for him. And he's found the way to talk to people. He did an election debate, and a junior doctor was like, "Are you going to settle our dispute?" And Keir was like, "Yes, we'll settle the dispute when we're in the government. This government don't have any intention of stopping the strikes or treating you fairly. But you've asked for 35%. That's not a negotiation. I can't give you 35%. Nobody ever gets what they ask for. You have to negotiate." And what was really interesting was the plain way he talked to the guy was nodding in agreement with him, even though he was being told he wasn't going to get his 35%. There's something of the tone and the vibe that Keir has, which is, I'm going to level with you. This isn't good at the moment. And it's going to take time to change. It's going to take 10 years, a decade to rebuild the country. And I think that's the basis for people saying, okay, I accept the bargain. I accept, there's a grand bargain coming. It's a shift in a lot of things that we're doing. And Keir uses the phrase, and Labour uses the phrase, mission-driven government. And I think that's really important. A mission-driven government is not saying I've got a policy, I'm a politician, I've got a policy, I'm going to do this to you. I'm going to do this to doctors, to nurses, to teachers, to police officers. It is saying we've got a problem. Let's all admit we've got a problem. What are we going to do about it? How can we? And I think there's a mobilising, liberating sense of the politics there, which will only be there when we get into government and when people go, actually, Labour aren't just cutting, they're not just doing this, they don't have only a Tory set of tools to address things. And so I think he's coming out of it as people are just getting the measure of him. And he became a leader in COVID. He couldn't go around the country. People hadn't seen him. They're now seeing him around the country. He's getting equal coverage on the news. And they're seeing him playing five-a-side football. He's in his early 60s. He plays such a good game of five-a-side football that his campaign director, Morgan McSweeney, who's a great campaign director, and some of your listeners will know of him. He's being Australian, he's good, well connected to the ALP. Morgan McSweeney says the other young guys in the party just stand off him, but he says, I just hack him because he's go past me. You have to. And so, but the fact he's just a natural to pick up football five-a-side, and that side of him, he's not flash, but we've tried big characters. We have Boris Johnson. So I think all of those politics is a contrast game, and you can say he's a bit of an unflashy figure, and you go, well, we tried that, didn't work.
I feel like there is authentic. He's sort of found his he's authentic, but not authentic in a contrived, which is not authentic, but like a log cabin story. He's owning up who he is.
Yeah.
Whereas Sunak, I notice, is obviously trying to say that he's in link with the common man. I saw that interview he did the other day where he was struggling to. I think the question was, tell me about your childhood and the experiences that you had that let us know that you know what hardship is like. And he struggled. He should have just said, hey, look, I grew up in a reasonably middle-class family. I can't give you the log cabin story you're looking for. But he didn't want to do that because he just was...
Yeah, no, and in a way, actually, I think what Sunak could have said is, my parents were immigrants. They got into the health service and they contributed to public services like migrants do. They saved for my education like migrant families do. They invested in my future because they saw my future as critical for the family. They sent me to one of the poshest schools possible. And you know what? Because I wasn't from the upper classes, because I was middle class, I was an outsider there. I loved the school and I love what it gave for me, but I know what it's like to come from a background where you have to work hard, where you are outsiders. I feel that, and you've got to turn your story into a kind of bridge that's got some empathy. And to say to try to find deprivation where there's no deprivation. Talk about the reality of your social setting, your psychological setting. It's never been easy, even now, to be a brown man in Britain. Like you do have, there is structural disadvantage, structural racism you can achieve, and his inability to deal with some of the language around race, I think and class is difficult for him. And I think that's one. Go back to my point. I think Labour's found a way to talk. There's a social democratic one, and it's kind of coming. We're virtually saying the classic social democratic story, which is our job is not to replace capitalism with socialism. That doesn't work. Our job is to save capitalism from itself, whether it's in climate, whether it's in employment. There's one thing I've not mentioned is Labour's got a really radical plan to regulate the gig economy, to turn people in precarious employment into employees, to work with their employers, but say we've got to re-regulate the labour market because the balance between capital and labour has gone too far in the UK. In all these ways, they patch together. They're very radical. I think it would be worth your listeners who are interested actually reading the manifesto. I think it's a good read, and it's got a solid spine of politics. And it's not Blairite politics, it's not centrist politics, it's centre-left politics. It's got the politics of Ed Miliband in there, who's become a really brilliant politician since he recovered from being a losing leader who lost an election. I think there's a lot in politicians who find themselves. There's a lot in politicians like Keir who've come to politics later in life. And there's something very interesting about where Labour's managed to get it to. It's disciplined, very disciplined. It can seem a bit dull because it's so disciplined, but it's also created this agenda which, if implemented, I think it will be a turning point in the country. And this will be looked back on as a major election for two reasons. One, the massive majority of Labour is likely to get, but also the shift in policies and the shift, as I say to my unionists who are friends and leaders who are friends, the shift in the possibilities. And in a sense, that's what a progressive government's about, is you change the possibilities. And that people, you can see the public are still in a mood. They just want a national act of exorcism. They just want to chuck these guys out. But you can sort of see beginning of people going, well, there's going to be a Labour government. It's going to be a Labour world. That's exciting, and starting to think about the expansion of their horizons.
Can we talk about the path to victory? 121 seats at a minimum is a lot in the Commons. Geographically, where is Labor focusing to pick up their seats?
So Labour's being very ambitious in this. It's been kind of strange. It's cautious, but it's also ambitious. And they're looking to gain seats in the broader southeast around London. London is really interesting. London in the 80s, when I first moved to London, was regarded by the UK Labour Party as a problem. And we were losing seats in London, but we had massive seats in Scotland. So the heartland of Labour was Scotland. Now London's the heartland. London is going to get, it's almost maxed out in Labour MPs. We're going to get more. And the fringes, the suburbs are coming to Labour. But also the towns around, somewhere like Colchester, somewhere like Basingstoke, you're going to see, in my view, you're going to see maybe 80 seats in London, the southeast, and more broadly, come to Labour. And then Labour's targeting Merseyside, the northwest, where about 80 or so seats are going to come in. So two big blocks there. The Red Wall, so-called because they were Labour voting areas which had constituencies which fell to the Tories on the Brexit issue. Labour, its first rebuilding was to bring them back. And I've always thought that when Scotland lost all Labour MPs apart from one in 2015, that was the first wall to fall. That was the Tartan Wall, and that is coming back. It's hard fought, and you can see predictions from pollsters of between 13 and 30 Labour seats. And that is because, as your listeners may know, a lot of the seats in Scotland are clustered in the central belt between Edinburgh and Glasgow. They were all solid Labour, they're now all solid SNP. Candidates and campaigning and targeting mean that there's a really tight margin in lots of those seats. So on the day, it depends. So Labour could really win if there's a big mood for Labour or Labour. But Labour's back in Scotland with a dozen, and having a foothold in Scotland, which is substantial, allows you to change the balance of the politics. And that's true of Wales. The Tories did really well in Wales in 2019, and that's come back to Labour too. So it's very different campaigns in different areas, but it's trying to be a national party. And I've got a good friend of mine who's standing in Salisbury, which is a town that's never had a Labour MP. He's 2 points ahead in the opinion polls over the Tory MP who's a minister, a minister in the Treasury. And that kind of thing, he's from there. Excuse me. He's from there. He's got a military background. He went to school there, and he represents a change in Salisbury and a different option for them. And I think that's going on. There's quite a lot of local campaigning where we've matched our candidate to the seat appropriately and given them a run at it. And the public there's a lot in my experience, there's a lot of tactical voting going on. People are choosing, if I want to get a Tory MP, who's my best candidate, a Labour or a Liberal Democrat? That's where there's a bit of a tension in Scotland, because the SNP are saying we're better. If you vote for us, you can get rid of the Tories too. But Labour's campaign in Scotland is basically, you want to change the government, have a Labour government, and we'll be better for it. So I think it's a campaign which started off targeting the 124 seats, then extended it when the polls were strong, and went all the way down the line, making sure the candidates were really well chosen. So, and we're being directed. My local constituency, we're a safe Labour seat. We were twinned with a marginal seat in London. We've now been twinned with a much more safe Tory seat in London. So there's a change in tactics going on all the time. And for people like you who really care about field operation, I think we've got one of the best field operations I've seen anywhere in the world. We've got an app that works, an app that you'll like this. If you knock on my door and I say that I'd like a steak, you stick it on the app, and within the day, somebody will come around and put a steak up in my garden. It's integrated, it's focused. It means we're doing much more with volunteers and much more with staff. It just feels like it's click, 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 and there's been a tight operation to transform the Labour Party, tight operation on policy, and it's tight field operation. I think you definitely learn from it.
Yeah, that was my question actually. Talk us about the enthusiasm on the ground amongst the rank and file membership and activist base of the party, because obviously everyone talked up about the Corbyn enthusiasm on polling day, and one would wonder, where does that enthusiasm come with the new leader? Are folks on the ground out there knocking on doors and doing that kind of work?
Yeah, people are out. There is a mood for change in the country, and there is, the thing I always think about political parties is the only successful discipline in parties is self-discipline. You can never tell a party to go in one direction, particularly Labour parties. Labour parties are full of people who've got their own view about everything, and that's why we debate. It's why we love being in the party. But in this case, we've decided to we want to march in one direction. We want to support Keir, and there's a real buzz when you're out with people. The seat I'm twinned with, I did a fundraiser for them yesterday, speaking at it, comparing it, and today they're going out 3 times, and at the weekend they're going out 4 times, and they've got enough people to go out 3 times today and 4 times at the weekend.
That's great.
That's the proof of where the dynamism and the enthusiasm is. And people are, my friend in Salisbury, he's got Tory switchers, he's got Lib Dem switchers coming and campaigning for him. So there's a lot of people who want to see change in the country. And there's quite a bit of evidence. I've talked to MPs who are candidates now, that if you have people on the doorstep, they're willing to listen to the case for change. And we set up a field operation that allows you time to talk. So it's not simply voter ID. So that, I think, that's a learning about how to campaign. And I think that is really working, because you've got persuasion is still, even right up to the last day of campaigning, persuasion is still part of the game, because you were making a case for change and the public are doubtful change can happen. You need to spread our enthusiasm, and I think that is working.
I mean, that's reassuring to hear that. Obviously, there's so many seats that you have to win. Therefore, it can't simply just be about voter registration and turnout. You clearly have to go bring some people back into your pile. What type of voter is the party targeting? I mean, can you say there is a type of voter that they're targeting, or is it sort of anyone with a heartbeat we're going after? Like, is there a kind of particular voter you're trying to bring to the red team?
Look, I mean, the thing is, until the polls were called, 45% of the country were saying they were going to vote Labour, which meant if you threw a rock, you had a 1 in 2 chance of hitting a Labour voter. So in a sense, it's the old Peter Mandelson thing. The Labour Party are the political wing of the British people. So there's a desire to get everybody, but balanced by the proper caution of a genuine field operation, which is you can't ask everybody. Like, there's some people who are not going to go for you. Mm. So I think you'd say that what we're looking for is people who believe there should be change, people who believe in Britain, people who are patriotic, people who were Labour voters, absolutely. So we acknowledge that people went from the party. We also acknowledge that the issue of Gaza has been divisive in the UK, and particularly in our base, and that there's, Labour Party has been clear. A Labour government sees the recognition of the state of Palestine as part of a process towards a two-state solution and peace and security for both those states. And so there's a proper acknowledgement that, like, you've got a big group of voters to hold together. You've got the ones you lost the last election, the ones you lost in Scotland a couple of elections before, and you've got the ones who are your base in urban areas, Muslim voters, and you need to hold on to them and reassure them. So it's a campaign that's, it's a cliche, but everybody says you can't be complacent, and you can't, and you have to appeal to, essentially, I suppose, you want to hold on to your urban voters, and you want to win your suburban and your country town voters, and it's a bit like the David Plouffe strategy for Obama in winning for America. You've got the voters, then you look at the ones who are closest to you, you get them, you hold them, you then move, and it's been this gradual process. And this is a classic campaign which has been going on for years, not weeks. This final year, the short campaign, I said the Tories at the beginning. I said the Tories were surprised by it. Labour's manifesto was finished for May. We had everything in place for May, the second election. All our candidates in place, all our policies in place, all our plans in place, where the campaign was going to go. The changes that have happened since the election has been declared is to go deeper and deeper into Tory territory, to campaign deeper and deeper. And as you know, in politics, if you campaign in people's safe seats, they have to fight back in those seats. They have less resource. And so yesterday, Rishi Sunak was in a seat with a 25,000 Tory majority.
Jesus.
And that shows you what their map of vulnerability is. Mm. And they've sort of stepped out of Tory seats with 10,000 majorities. They're just leaving them to Labour to campaign in.
I did see one of the was it the Survation that does a poll predictor that has Labor finishing with 450 odd seats in the Commons, and the Tories reduced to 72.
Yeah, for about the last 12 months, I've been saying 450 seats feels like a likely point, and that we shouldn't neglect the idea there might be 500. This is an extraordinary. The tectonic plates are shifting in British politics, and it's going to be an extraordinary result. And Survation and a number of other people do what are called MRP polls, multiple regression stratified, blah blah. They're really interesting to look at. There's one published yesterday with an interactive map by Ipsos Mori, and they used a random sample of 20,000 people, so a massive. It's really expensive to do random samples in polling, and they are predicting a similarly devastating thing. And they've got about 100 seats on a tiny knife edge for the Tories. So it still feels impossible for them to lose the position of official opposition. But the Tory campaign message has shifted this week to don't let Labour have a massive majority and us be a tiny opposition.
Jeez.
And I think they think it's clever, and it's like, I've likened it to saying, I'm a loser. Please don't let me lose so badly. And all the voters here is, I'm a loser. Okay, if you're a loser, I'm not going to have a bar of you.
Yeah.
And
that strategy never works. It never, ever works. I don't know why campaigns do that.
No, I know. And it's like I said, every single campaign mistake you could ever imagine is happening. And that the switch to, it'll be an elective dictatorship. It's like, so you had a big majority and that was fine. And if Labour and it's almost like, it's I think there was an episode of The West Wing where a Democrat strategist who's quite punchy came in and said, we always lose because we go, don't hurt me, please don't hurt me. And you need to be out there. And I did a TV show, I did Sky TV at the weekend, and a Tory MP who's been he's a former minister, it's his 10th election campaign. He sat there and he had a better set of messages that he'd done himself than the Tory campaign has. And he said we got help for housing for young people. We've got help for workers with tax break for small businesses. There's 7 million of them in the country or whatever. And we've got help for pensioners with quadruple lock on. And he was just able to go boom, boom, boom. And there's no story, there's no narrative, there's no messaging. And I think it goes to the fundamentals, which is all politics in the end is time for a change versus steady as she goes. So change versus status quo. And Labour said change, and we are the change. And the Tories started by going, don't risk the change, which is pretty well the only thing you can do against the change message. And then they went, but we're also change. And it's like, you can't be status quo and change. But you can't say change is risk and then say stick with us because we're the change. I think that strategic confusion at the heart is running through in all the mistakes. In a sense, it's that setting in the middle. And I suspect it's a very tight core of people in number 10 who are doing everything, all the decision making. And when you get groupthink in those moments, the journalist didn't notice it, but the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, the Treasurer, he didn't turn up at the Conservative Party manifesto launch. He wasn't there. He was, I think, according to his Facebook, he was standing outside a railway station filming himself saying there needs to be more parking places for commuters. So he's doing pavement politics. And we've not really talked about that's probably an effective campaign in his locality using Facebook, knowing he's got older voters. Labour have got a huge TikTok game. Labour hadn't been on TikTok before, nor had the Tories, and Labour were beating like 10-1 in terms of clicks through. And Labour's social media game is worth people just browsing through the Twitter and the TikTok stuff. Labour's got a sense of humour, quick responses, and it's got that lightness of touch. So almost every bit of the campaign, great campaigns, every bit is great, is separate, but they've got the same level of quality. Poor campaigns, they trip each other up and everything they're doing. You see that with the Tories. Yeah. And so Labour put a lot of work into being in this position, and they're cashing it, and they're still showing flex in the campaign, because again, that's another thing in a campaign. Don't stick to your strategy. The strategy's there to get you somewhere, but have some flexibility.
I want to get your thoughts on some of the minor parties. You've spoken about the SNP and the predicament they're in Scotland. Can we talk quickly about Reform Party and Nigel Farage has put his hand up. I did notice in some of the recent polling figures that there is a slight dip in the support for both Labor and the Tories. I'm assuming, first of all, that dip in the Tory, can't dip anymore, but there's a pickup for both Reform and the Lib Dems. Is the Reform Party going to really, really hurt the Conservatives as well, kind of like rub salt on the wounds in this result?
Look, I think Nigel Farage is a disruptive figure in British politics, and he senses weakness whenever he sees it. And he just was watching, and was a late declaration to come back in. He basically sacked the leader of his party, became leader, gave up his TV show, sacked the candidate in the seat, Clacton, on the coast, where the guy's actually now standing against him, and put himself in there. And his desire is to destroy the Tory party, and he's doing a good job, because the Tory party are going through what we've seen in other European parties, which is a crisis of conservatism, a crisis of Christian democracy. See it in America. Trump is not a traditional Republican by any manner of means, but he calls traditional Republican, calls them rhinos, Republicans in name only. Farage is putting in the centre of the Tory party this choice: are you a populist party of the right, as many of the parties have come in Europe, or are you a centrist Conservative party? And the Tories don't know what to do, because they've been compromising with their own right wing on Brexit, on their own right wing on immigration. And basically, I think Farage is offering what I call the Coke strategy. I'm the real thing. If you want an anti-immigration, populist Conservative, it's me. And it terrifies the Tories, because they don't know what to do, even though the evidence is from the Labour Party, the votes are in the centre. Just because Labour's got them, you can't say they've got them, we should be on the right. And there's a kind of there's a vicious circle, a doom loop really going on the right of British politics, which is, because the Conservatives are in government, they've been treated more seriously than a party that's got a 20-point deficit should be. And by that I mean, Labour's been going to win since October 2022. But journalism has been about, can the Tories come back? And they've focused a lot on the Tories doing this and that on the right. The Tories have been fighting for a third of the vote since October 2022. Farage has noted that, and he's coming right at the moment and said, okay, let's see who represents that third of the vote on the right of British politics, because Labour's taken back socially conservative working class people. We're now left with, and that fight, I don't think that Reform will win many seats, but I think they will change the nature of right-wing politics in the UK. And they may split the Tory party. I know former Tory MPs who are no longer voting Tory, and their families who've been, for the last century, these are respectable home counties outside, Surrey or Hampshire, Tories to the bone, and they're not going to vote Tory. They're going to vote Labour. I heard this, that somebody who's in Margaret Thatcher's strategy unit was asked to write an article supporting the Tories, and he's going, no, most of my mates are voting Labour. And it's like the case for conservatism has gone by default in a way. It's not been defended, and the case for populism on the right it's got an audience. It's not big enough to win an election, but it's big enough to disrupt the Conservative election. So I think what's going on the right is going to be an argument for a decade to come. And the Tory party, the cabinet members, former cabinet members, are split. Should Farage be allowed into the Tory party and then become the leader, or should he be excluded because he's trying to destroy the Tory party? And when you're in a party that can't decide whether your enemy is your enemy or your friend, it's Labour parties, in my experience, always go through a bad period when they say there's no enemies to the left. There are always enemies to the left. Conservative parties get in a bad place when they go, no enemies to the right. Good parties need strong fences and boundaries because there's different political traditions. The Liberal Democrats, I think, are more interesting in a funny way, that they were in the coalition. They promised to abolish tuition fees for students. They eventually in government signed up to trebling them. They were punished by the country for breaking that promise. And they're now back from the naughty step. They've been held out for long enough, and they're seen as a vehicle to punish the Conservative Party. They're a piece of 4x2 that can be used by voters to beat up on the Tories. And they've managed to position themselves in the centrist place that the Tory party should be, which is, we're not social democrats. We believe in some things that Labour do, but not all of it. So on the Green side, we go further. Some on other issues, we wouldn't go as far as Labour. We're not for the workers' rights package that Labour are for. And they're occupying a space that the Tories should have. And I think the dip in Tory vote is Tory votes going to reform. And I think the dip in Labour vote is Labour voters going, if you ask me now, at the next election, I will be voting Liberal Democrat. Not because I've become a Liberal Democrat, but because I will be voting Liberal Democrat, because they will be the people to get rid of the Tories in this area. So you're sort of seeing the impact of actual tactical voting coming through in people's statements. Because, if you ask me, am I Labour? I say, yeah, I'm Labour. You ask me, will I vote Labour? Yes. If I were in one of those rural constituencies where there is a chance of getting rid of the Tory but the Liberal Democrat candidate, I would personally never vote Lib Dem. But I know people who've done that, and I've got friends in the Lake District who are going to do that because they've been Labour all their lives, but they're going, the only way to make sure you don't have a Tory is do this. And I think that will, if you ask them how are you going to vote, they'll say this. If you ask them who they are, they'll say I'm Labour. So I think the polls are showing psychological shifts in the politics.
That's a fantastic insight. I feel like I've seen through time now with that, because I did wonder about that. That bit of research. Can we expand a little bit out of Britain? And I want to ask you about the European elections that just happened and get a sense from you about what is happening in Western Europe or the EU compared to what is happening in Britain, because obviously there's a lot of head scratching going on by Social Democrats in Europe off the back of the European elections. It wasn't a great result for the broad left, wasn't a great result for the Greens in particular. They got their asses kicked in a whole bunch of countries, particularly Germany, which is the biggest, most populated country in Europe. So things aren't going well in Europe for the left, but obviously things, based on our podcast here, things are going very well for the left in Britain. Why are we seeing this happen now at this moment?
So I do think there's something about having a Labour Party, and like in a way I would, but the formation of a Labour Party is the unions and a political party of the centre left tied together, and that for me, that has always been in my experience in the UK, that the unions are an anchor to reality. The Tories are going to struggle in opposition because there's nothing that's going to stop them going further and further to the right. In the Labour Party, the Labour movement eventually goes, our members need representation in government. So I always think you need to think of us as a social democratic, but a Labour Party as well. In France, the left has never really had a social democratic tradition. It's had a socialist party, and the Socialist Party was historically it was a vehicle for Francois Mitterrand to become prime minister. The Macron is a centrist, a radical centrist, a Jupiterian centrist, and he's probably run to the end of his bag of tricks. And French politics in presidential elections is always described as, in the first round you vote for who you want, and the second round you vote against the person you don't want. Yeah. And so the contest is always to be the one who's not the far right candidate, on the basis that everybody who doesn't want a far right president will vote for you. Macron has pulled that off twice. By calling it a snap election, I think he's being too clever by half, but it may lead to something interesting. There's been a left alliance created, and it looks as though if Le Pen's party win the large number of seats in the French National Assembly, this left alliance will win the second largest. Now, it's got a problem. It's led by the demagogic Mélenchon, but it's got possibilities because it is a left alliance. It's a creation of something that's a vehicle. So that for me is interesting. In Holland, the Labour Party, in its alliance with the Greens, did better than expected in a country where Geert Wilders and the right had won in the parliamentary elections, and that's a good sign for me too. For me, the overall politics of Europe are, the collapse of Christian democracy, because the Republicans in France collapsed, disappeared. The Christian Democrats in Italy disappeared. The Christian Democrats in Germany struggling. The Social Democrats obviously struggling too. And other right parties in Finland or in Sweden deciding they can't win enough votes from the centre, but they could go into government with the far right. So there's a big debate on the right in German politics. You see and settle in normally. If we continue to oppose the far right and their politics, we'll never be in government, except with Social Democrats, except with the left centre parties. And the right have decided tactically that they should align themselves with the far right parties. Now, that's the debate in a way that's going on with the Tory party and reform. And it is, in my view, is the politics of if you choose to ride the tiger will eventually eat you. And it is a challenge for Social Democrats. And I kind of think it's a question in European politics, but it's here too in the UK. Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and Liberal Democrats have one thing in common. They're Democrats, and we're from a democratic tradition. We're not demagogues, we're not populists. And that in certain places, certain times, and it happened in Germany, a grand coalition of the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, you have to defend the institutions of democracy. And if you don't do that, you have Trump. You have a competitive candidate for president in America who is saying he will rip up democratic norms. And so for me, there's a bigger conversation, which is we need our opponents, our conservative parties, to respect the same norms as us. And it's to some extent, being in government, one of your big successes is changing your opponents. Labour Party under Tony Blair was in long enough to force the Tories to accept equal marriage and then actually legislate for it. You change your party from homophobic to in favour of equal marriage. The ALP forced the Liberal Party to accept socialised medicine. They couldn't get back until they finally. So the voters have a way, and our parties have to be a vehicle for establishing, embedding, refreshing norms, certain norms. And so it's going to be at some point in the interest of European Social Democrats, not just to rebuild themselves, but to rebuild a decent conservative movement. And that is, in one sense, by any means necessary, the most successful fight back against the right in Austria was the presidential campaign where the Green candidate won. And he won with a great campaign in which the first thing they did was take back the word Heimat, homeland. And they said this language of Heimat, homeland, cannot be a language of the right. It's a language of the country and love of country. And so there's a whole set of lessons to be learned. But yeah, the right did less strongly, and they are in. I've met with the Italian ambassador in the UK at dinner, and he says, they're not political, obviously, but he says, the thing about Giorgia Meloni, she's a good European. She's not trying to blow up the European institutions. She's trying to make them work. And there is something about strong institutions also make strong Democrats. And so there's more flux in Europe. I've not been to see my European colleagues and comrades since the elections. It is bad. It is dispiriting. But at the core of it, you asked about what are the issues in the UK. Cost of living, huge issue. The other thing is growth and productivity. The European economy, the Eurozone, is sluggish. Europe is aging. Europe's growth is slowing. Germany, the motor growth literally because it's driven by the car industry. The car industry is changing to electric vehicles. China's coming in to dominate the electric vehicle industry. But even if Germany transitioned to electric vehicles, electric vehicles don't have engines. engines are a whole other industry. So car building and engine building and part. So there's a big restructuring going on inside the European economy, and that's always going to have, I think, some political expression. And in the end, everything that's going on in the UK, whether it is the impact, the force of Gaza and some of Labour's base, whether it is the cost of living, whether everything has got a material reality to which a social democrat needs to have an answer. Labour's decided a growth agenda, a green growth agenda, a decarbonising agenda, a social democrat agenda, and I hope that the results of us winning and then being strong in government will be something that we can then take with the campaigning techniques, which I think are world class, and the political approach and the governing approach.
I always like to end a podcast on a very positive note, and I think, John, you just did that. I had one more question I was going to ask you about where I think the left is struggling in Europe, but let's just end on where I think the left are doing very well, which is in the UK. And I hope we get a great result on the 4th of July, an August date in American politics, but maybe an August date for British politics this year. Thanks very much for coming on the show today, John.
Great.
We appreciate your time and your insight, and good luck on election day, and hopefully we'll talk to you after the result and get a great result for Labor.
Okay, that'd be great. See you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.